Edmund Featherstone here, and I would like you to picture a pope in full regalia yelling at a corpse dressed in matching papal robes, while a very nervous deacon tries to serve as the corpse's lawyer. Yes, that is a real thing that happened, and no, you are not hallucinating from too much late-night cheese. If this mental image made you smile in that slightly horrified way, do me a favor, click like, and in the comments tell me what profession you'd least like to see represented by a corpse on trial, dentist maybe, and of course subscribe, because apparently medieval Rome is the gift of chaos that never stops giving. So here is what actually happened. In the late 9th century, the papacy had become less an institution of holiness and more a high-stakes game of musical chairs, except instead of music there were angry noble families, and instead of chairs there were daggers. Amid this carnival atmosphere wandered Pope Stephen VI, who decided that the best way to assert dominance was not diplomacy or prayer, but dragging his long-dead predecessor back into court like a guest star in an especially grim sitcom. The stage was set for one of the strangest judicial spectacles in history, one where the smell alone probably should have counted as contempt of court. And to understand why anyone thought this was a good idea, we have to step back and look at Rome around the year 897. Imagine a city still recovering from centuries of sackings, power struggles, and the occasional awkward Viking raid, while also trying to keep track of which pope was which. At this point, the average Roman probably needed a flowchart just to attend Mass. Rival noble families treated the papal throne less like a sacred seat of St. Peter and more like first prize in a neighbourhood squabble that occasionally involved sword fights in alleys. In this climate, Pope Stephen VI seems to have woken up one morning and thought to himself, "Regular enemies are fine, but why not add the undead to the list?" The problem, at least according to Stephen, was that Pope Formosus had committed all sorts of churchly offences, including illegally becoming pope in the first place, which is a strong statement when the alleged offender has already decomposed to the point of being more skeleton than statesman. The conflict was technically about politics and legitimacy, but in practice it resembled a macabre puppet show where no one could agree whether to laugh, cry, or start gagging from the smell. For Stephen, dragging a corpse into court promised some kind of victory over his opponents. For everyone else, it probably just promised nightmares and a lifelong suspicion of papal processions. To unpack how things unraveled to the point of a full-on zombie tribunal, we need to linger for a moment in late 9th century Rome. Not the romantic Rome of fountains and philosophers, but the version that smelled mostly of damp stone and political desperation. The papacy by this point had evolved, or maybe dissolved, into something resembling a family-operated crime syndicate with incense. The once spiritual office of St. Peter had become the object of tug-of-war between Roman aristocrats, particularly two families so feisty that wedding invitations doubled as battle strategies. If you were born into the Tusculani or the Spoleto lineages, your baptism probably came with a ceremonial dagger and a list of church positions to claim before age 35. This constant jostling for papal control meant popes were elected more like neighbourhood block captains during a blackout. One side would muscle in, get their guy on the throne, and then the other side would retaliate, often by accusations of simony, heresy, or the truly medieval crime of being from the wrong family. These weren't theological debates so much as thinly veiled episodes of political revenge, documented in Latin and sometimes literally chiselled into stone walls to survive the next coup. The fact that half these popes made it to their confessional without being stabbed was a small miracle. The fact that the other half didn't, well, that's why we're here. Pope Formosus, the unlucky star of our tale, had managed to climb the treacherous ladder of church politics all the way to the top in the year 891. His name, which does sound a bit like an off-brand skincare product, means beautiful in Latin, though not much about his later biography fits that descriptor. Before claiming the papacy, he had served as bishop of a region called Porto, gone on diplomatic missions for earlier popes, and apparently annoyed just enough people in both Rome and Constantinople to be declared excommunicated, reinstated, and almost promoted, all within a few decades. His career was a sort of ecclesiastical roller coaster ride that ended rather unceremoniously in death, which would have been fine except for what came next. By the time he died in the year 896, Formosus had made plenty of enemies, the kind who didn't believe in letting a good grudge die just because the body did. Chief among these was Stephen VI, who became pope shortly afterward, likely thanks to some strategic muscle flexing from the powerful Spoleto family. The Spoletans, among other things, specialized in using church appointments like pawns in a regional chess game. If someone failed to support their bid for dominance in central Italy, that someone might find themselves exhumed and publicly shamed. This is not an exaggeration. This was evidently a policy. And so we arrive at the question that has puzzled generations. Why did Pope Stephen VI put a corpse on trial? Well, in the slippery logic of 9th century Rome, Stephen needed to invalidate Formosus's papal acts to strengthen the Spoletan grip on power. If Formosus was posthumously declared an illegitimate pope, then every bishop he ordained, every political alliance he wove, and every administrative decree he scribbled down could potentially be undone. It was, in short, the legal equivalent of right-clicking your predecessor and selecting undo entire papacy. Of course, this would have been easier if Formosus hadn't already been buried, and yet here we are. The Church at this time maintained a deep concern for ritual purity and spiritual legitimacy, except when it came to common sense. So when Stephen announced that Formosus would be exhumed and tried, the court apparently didn't laugh, scream, or immediately resign. No, they moved ahead with formal preparations. A trial was organized, a tribunal assembled, and the mortal remains of Formosus were dug up from their resting place, presumably accompanied by a lot of awkward throat-clearing and servants drawing straws over who had to do the lifting. One gets the impression that even hardened gravediggers had second thoughts that day, though probably not enough job security to voice them. Historical sources note that by the time of the trial, Formosus had been dead for approximately 7 months. This is not a number one typically associates with peak freshness. The summer heat and general Roman air quality would have done their work, meaning that when the body was placed upright on the papal throne for its day in court, the effect was somewhere between ceremonial dignity and high Gothic horror. Eyewitness accounts say he was dressed once again in full liturgical vestments, most likely held upright by ropes, and given a deacon to speak on his behalf, an honour for the deacon that must have felt deeply optional. None of this, it should be said, stopped Pope Stephen from carrying out the proceedings with grim determination. Charges were read aloud. Accusations were made. The corpse, for its part, remained silent on all counts, which in the Vatican courts is generally considered bad form. The central allegation was that Formosus had illegally assumed the papacy while still holding the bishopric of Porto, breaking canon law. That no one had objected to this loudly at the time of coronation seemed to matter less than the dramatic value of public condemnation now. And so the theatre unfolded with all the legal gravitas and moral clarity you might expect from a city run by warring families and septuagenarian cardinals with grudges older than some civilizations. The trial, often referred to as the Cadaver Synod or Synodus Horrenda, a name that sounds like a heavy metal album about a medieval inquest, lasted for some days. What the court stenographers recorded during this period is unclear, but one assumes they worked quickly and held their breath. The outcome, of course, was never in doubt. Formosus was declared guilty. His papacy was retroactively annulled. His corpse, still dressed like a pope and now legally a fraud, was stripped of its vestments. His blessing fingers, the ones used to anoint and consecrate, were sliced off in a flourish of both symbolism and minor dismemberment. Then, as if that weren't enough closure, his body was thrown into the Tiber River. Some say it washed up later and was secretly retrieved by monks. Others suspect it drifted downstream, possibly imagining even the fish were judging him. Still, in the surreal calculus of 9th century Rome, the Cadaver Synod briefly accomplished what it was meant to. It terrified Stephen's enemies, reinforced the Spolitan claim to influence, and proved that vengeance in the Holy See could remain on the table long after the person was under it. But as with many great acts of dramatic overkill, the consequences turned out to have a velocity all their own. Because once you start dragging corpses into court, it gets tricky to draw the line between justice, madness, and whatever holy bureaucracy is trying to reenact Hamlet with clergy. But we'll get to that. First, let's take a breath, light a mental candle, and admire the Baroque absurdity it took to orchestrate an ecclesiastical trial starring someone who couldn't blink. As it turns out, once you publicly dress down a decomposing pope and toss his remains into the nearest river, the ripple effects are hard to contain. Pope Stephen VI emerged from the Cadaver Synod with a peculiar sort of authority, less that of a spiritual shepherd, more that of a man who had proven he could win an argument with the dead and wasn't terribly concerned about the living. Temporarily, this made him powerful. It also made him somewhat radioactive, as in, people knew he had influence, but no one really wanted to stand too close in case he tried to resolve another disagreement by exhuming their grandfather. At this point, various factions around Rome began to nervously adjust their loyalties. A group of bishops reportedly attempted to distance themselves from the whole affair by drafting letters so diplomatically vague they may have actually looped back into being rude. Meanwhile, rival aristocratic families, particularly the Tusculani, that other eternally scowling clan, saw an opening. If Stephen could out-crazy the usual level of church drama, then perhaps a gentle nudge, or maybe a low-level coup, could return things to their preferred flavour of chaos, preferably one that smelled less like decay and more like incense and old coins. The monkish chroniclers of the time, diligent scribblers with a flair for disapproval, began to register their unease. One described the events as most foul and execrable, which is the medieval Latin equivalent of a Yelp review that ends with "would not recommend." Another indicated that heavenly judgment would fall upon Stephen for prosecuting a corpse, although they were slightly less clear on the timeline. Still, when the scribes start writing like Old Testament prophets, it's usually safe to assume that public sentiment is wobbling. Over the next few months, Rome accrued an impressive number of conspiracy theories for a city without regular plumbing. Some whispered that Formosus's ghost still haunted the Lateran palace, groaning at irregular intervals and knocking over candlesticks at inconvenient moments. Others claimed that strange fish had begun appearing in the fountains, as if nature itself were sending aquatic omens. In one particularly vivid account, a local priest allegedly dropped a communion wafer mid-mass, stared at it in horror, and declared that the body of Christ had refused to be complicit. This statement was vague, theological, and probably invented, but it gained immediate traction among nervous parishioners who now preferred to worship from a cautious distance. Meanwhile, Pope Stephen VI showed signs of what theologians might describe as unravelling gently. He began issuing increasingly erratic decrees, one of which involved reclassifying a minor local saint as unworthily over-venerated. This decision offended precisely everyone and achieved nothing, except possibly antagonizing the relic custodians in 4 districts. He was also said to have grown paranoid, muttering about plots and shadows and untrustworthy choir masters. As popes go, this was still within what 9th century Rome considered a manageable decline, though only just. And then, of course, came the sparrow incident. According to an account preserved in an obscure and possibly unhinged monastery manuscript, a small finch flew into the basilica during evening prayers, landed on the papal throne, and chirped exactly 9 times before flying off. Stephen took it as an omen. Others suspected the bird simply preferred acoustics. Either way, the next morning, Stephen declared a public fast to atone for the sins of anointed injustices. No one was entirely sure whether he meant Formosus or himself, possibly both, possibly neither. Again, the sparrow refused to clarify. While Rome tried to divine meaning from bird behaviour, the Spoletan faction, who had originally backed Stephen, began to sense that their chosen pope might be both a liability and a public embarrassment. They had ordered an exhumation trial, expecting firm messaging and theological closure, not haunted sacraments and avian prophecy. More importantly, other Italian principalities and church authorities were beginning to respond with formal concern. When bishops in distant regions start sending you adorably passive-aggressive letters titled "On the Matter of Corpse Trials and Shared Doctrine," it's probably time to reconsider your political strategy. And so the conspirators began to move. Little things at first. Daily reports not being delivered. Ceremonial cakes arriving late or not at all. A ceremonial staff found mysteriously snapped in 2, accidentally no doubt. By autumn, the whispers of discontent had graduated into outright meetings, most of which involved discreet candlelight and at least one trusted family nun to oversee the refreshments. Finally, after one especially tense Sunday Mass, in which Stephen misread the Gospel entirely and then accused 2 archdeacons of sabotage, the nobility had had enough. In the waning weeks of the year 897, Pope Stephen VI was arrested. The records do not specify exactly who carried it out, but it was likely a mix of church officials, moderately upset aristocrats, and at least one palace staff member who had quietly kept a running ledger of grievances. He was stripped of office, locked away in a monastic prison cell, and later found strangled to death by unknown hands. Officially, this was chalked up to excessive penitence. Unofficially, there were few tears shed, especially not among former deacons with PTSD from the Cadaver Synod's opening statement. Stephen's fall was met with what one chronicler described as muted relief, verging on polite celebration. The Tusculani moved quickly to install their preferred candidate. Rome, for a moment, basked in a calming illusion of restored propriety, but the damage had been done. Like trying to untoast a bread loaf, the memory of a pope trying another pope's corpse just would not fade. Other bishops began nervously retro-checking their own resumes to be sure they hadn't inadvertently officiated at any now illegitimate sacraments. A few begged local monks to rebaptize them, just in case. The monks, for their part, asked to be paid in advance, and so the ecclesiastical game board reset itself. A new pope arrived. Ceremonies resumed. Choirs dutifully sang responses to Latin phrases that no longer felt quite so timeless. But underneath the incense and marble, a quiet tremor settled into the church's foundation. Something had shifted. The line between papal authority and surreal performance was now less a line and more of a watercolour blur. As for the body of Pope Formosus, well, reports vary. Some say it was retrieved from the Tiber and buried in secret, this time securely and with less papal meddling. Others insist Formosus appeared in visions to shepherds and scribes, usually frowning and rarely wearing shoes. A few very determined relic hunters even tried to locate his severed fingers, claiming they could still impart blessings under the right moon. Whether any of them succeeded remains unclear. What we do know is that Formosus's posthumous career sparked not just outrage and counter-outrage, but an entire doctrinal tangle that the Church would spend decades trying to quietly unwind. Because even in Rome, where drama commodified faster than relic dust, a tribunal starring a corpse was still considered a bit much. Now, if this had been the end of it, a bizarre one-act tragedy, morbid but self-contained, we might simply file it under unfortunate papal enthusiasm and move on. But this was 9th century Rome, where consequences floated downstream like bodies in the Tiber, and rarely came to rest in expected places. The moment Formosus's bloated corpse hit the river, it was as though a switch had been flipped somewhere deep beneath the Lateran palace, activating a new level of churchly chaos not even Dante would have dared footnote. For starters, the people of Rome, who had watched the Cadaver Synod unfold with the dazed resignation of folks long accustomed to metaphor turning literal, began to grow uneasy. Not because a corpse had been tried, that was, by local standards, barely a misdemeanour, but because things had gone too smoothly. There had been due process, oddly scripted ceremony, even a verdict. It had all been too organised, and that made people suspicious. In Rome, when things ran efficiently, it usually meant someone very dangerous was about to be assassinated. Enter Theodora, no, not that Theodora from Byzantium, but a different one of equal flair and significantly more political leverage in central Italy. Depending on the year and your political alignment, Lady Theodora was either a noble matron devoted to restoring the church, or someone who stabbed cardinals with a hairpin whenever her horse lost a shoe. She also happened to be married to a man with enough military clout to threaten the Vatican from across the piazza, and her reaction to the cadaver trial was simple, yet provocative. She laughed until she cried, then sent her cousin to the clergy with the suggestion that perhaps Pope Stephen required a long sabbatical, preferably in an oubliette. As the city's back streets hummed with fresh conspiracy, and river fishermen reported sightings of a damp pontiff drifting gently through the reeds, the church began to split again. Not along theological lines, of course, that would have been too mainstream, but over Formosus himself. Some claimed he had been a saint, divinely persecuted. Others said he should have stayed buried and, frankly, had been a bit smug while alive. A third group, made mostly of bewildered monastic scribes, began quietly forming a cult around his left pinky finger, which was rumoured to have floated into a fountain in Trastevere, where it promptly turned green and emitted a faint bell sound at midnight. This, predictably, did not help. Meanwhile, Pope Stephen VI, possibly the only man in Rome who still thought the whole affair had gone rather well, began experiencing what historians gently describe as a decline in public support. Whispers in the basilicas turned into mutterings at taverns, which in turn became placards written in chicken blood, nailed to the cathedral doors, usually accompanied by someone's severed goat. Rome's symbolic language had always favoured clarity. Needing allies, and perhaps unaware of how few remained, Stephen began promoting clergy who agreed with him to absurd extents. A bishop of Porto, who once described Formosus as having the charisma of a soggy sponge, was suddenly Archbishop of Ravenna. A deacon who had performed poorly in goat herding but agreed the Cadaver Synod had been satisfyingly thorough was inexplicably made treasurer. Even the choir director, a man chiefly known for violent sneezing, was rewarded with control over 3 abbeys and 14 crates of votive candles that may have been cursed. Still, perhaps the strangest post-trial consequence came from the rural countryside. A small abbey in the Sabine Hills, which had once housed a quietly heretical order devoted to baking very tall bread, now began claiming they had received visions from St. Formosus. These visions, helpfully transcribed by a monk whose Latin had not advanced beyond third declensions, foretold rivers turning to wine, frogs falling from tower windows, and a papal ring reappearing in the left shoe of a bear. Word spread, pilgrims arrived, and someone attempted to bottle the local fountain water as Formosian elixir for gout and murder confusion. Naturally, this drew ire from the Vatican, which at the time preferred its saints either long dead or politically vanilla. More importantly, it led to a formal investigation headed by a priest named Flavio, who once accidentally excommunicated himself during a badly rehearsed sermon, but was nevertheless considered diplomatically competent. His trip to the abbey ended prematurely when his donkey developed an allergy to incense and collapsed in the road with a wheezing honk. Flavio called this divine resistance and went home to write a strong letter, which was never delivered because its recipient had just been thrown down a stairwell. Back in Rome, things tilted from the surreal into the faintly operatic. Rumours began circling that Formosus's corpse had not in fact stayed in the river. Witnesses disagreed wildly on what happened next. One claimed to have seen it dragged ashore by a band of rogue nuns who spoke Esperanto 2 centuries early. Another insisted it was retrieved by a man in a mask shaped like an avocado who wept while reading aloud from Cicero. Still another believed the body had dried out on a sandbar and was now being used as a scarecrow outside Tivoli. None of these theories stood up to scrutiny or gravity. These rumours, annoyingly persistent, began to damage what credibility remained of Stephen's papacy. And although medieval Rome was never overly concerned with whether a pope was beloved, it did prefer them to be feared, or at least unpredictable in a less seasonal way. The end came, as it usually did for 9th century popes, in the form of very short notice and even shorter rope. In what the scribes referred to as a sudden outbreak of justice, Stephen VI was imprisoned, then strangled, presumably after someone finally asked, with exasperated sincerity, what he had been thinking. His body, unlike Formosus's, was not tried, but quietly buried, possibly upside down. No trial was held, no choirs sang. It was a mercifully boring death, by Roman standards. And yet the shadow of Formosus lingered. His name, though disgraced on paper, became feverishly invoked in back alleys and candle-lit corners where scholars met to debate difficult questions, like whether a finger blessed after death still counted, or whether papal authority technically extended to exhumed heretics. Oddly enough, his papal seal, long thought lost, reappeared unburnt in the pocket of a cardinal who swore he had never owned robes with pockets. But perhaps the strangest aftermath of all was the sudden resurgence in funerary etiquette manuals. By the year 900, it became fashionable once again to bury bishops in crypts rather than shallow bankside graves, with at least 2 witnesses not related by blood or debt. A pamphlet titled "How to Stay Buried, a Practical Guide for the Clergy," circulated anonymously for decades. Chapter 1 was succinct: "Do not antagonize popes with theatrical inclinations, or failing that, at least die in a place with poor drainage." Naturally, one might assume that the spectacle of a cadaver trial would be the low point of the papacy's quarterly reputation, but history, ever the relentless improviser, was just getting warmed up. Rather than recoil in horror, or perhaps write a strongly worded scroll to their local cardinal, the Roman populace responded to the spectacle with what can only be described as morbid fascination. Reports suggest that attendance at the Cadaver Synod was unexpectedly high, with some attendees bringing their own stools, bread loaves, and even dried figs, as if preparing for an unruly community theatre production. One monk later remarked that the mood, while sombre, was punctuated by uneasy giggling and at least one vendor hawking saint-shaped candles. The unfortunate deacon assigned to defend the corpse, whose name may have been Peter, though 2 sources call him Bernard for no apparent reason, suffered a nervous breakdown midway through the trial. Recountings from the time suggest he attempted to plead insanity, then remembered he was not the one on trial. After Formosus lost, Peter, or possibly Bernard, was seen quietly excusing himself from public life, last spotted raising goats along the coast near Ostia, and reportedly speaking only in Gregorian chant. The goats were not impressed. Meanwhile, Pope Stephen VI, having tasted the intoxicating brew of posthumous vengeance, did not stop there. He ordered an official document drafted to declare that any ordinations performed by Formosus were now invalid. This created a tiny legal hurricane, as dozens of bishops and priests who owed their positions to Formosus were suddenly in ecclesiastical limbo. The Church, rarely agile on a good day, now had to determine whether entire sacraments might be retroactively annulled due to their tainted lineage. Theologians convened to debate whether God operated on paperwork or instinct. No consensus was reached, but someone invented a new form of liturgical error known as blessing drift. Among those affected was a particularly agitated bishop from Naples named Felicio, who had only just learned to read Latin in time to sign his own appointment documents. He stormed into the Lateran palace with a goat-hide satchel full of notarized scrolls, and harassed no fewer than 3 junior clerks before realizing he was in the wrong building. After finding the correct room, he presented his case in what one observer called passionate but mostly shrill syllables. Stephen had him escorted out by 2 guards wearing mismatched boots, because the palace budget for uniformity had been redirected toward corpse-related expenses. Of course, justice being a wheel with many unnecessarily ornate spokes, all of this came back to bite Stephen rather quickly. Political enemies began whispering that perhaps a man so obsessed with litigation against decomposed rivals might not be the most stable pontiff in Rome's long and questionably stable history. But the real turning point came when an earthquake, not a metaphor, shook the city just weeks after the trial. A chunk of masonry reportedly fell from an archway and flattened a crate full of communion wafers. Someone declared it an omen. Someone else tried to eat the crushed wafers anyway. In the medieval logic of Rome, natural disasters could only mean one thing: divine disapproval. And there was only one truly dramatic event to blame. Within days, a whisper campaign turned into loud wailing. Priests who had loyally cheered Stephen's cadaver performance now found themselves reburying old relics for luck. A group of nuns reportedly exchanged coded prayers, suggesting it might be time for a different kind of spring cleaning. Meanwhile, the Tiber River, having recently digested a papal corpse, overflowed its banks again that spring, presumably in protest. Enter a new wrinkle: a nobleman named Adalbert, who had a habit of inserting himself into these crises like a politically curious moth. Adalbert was the sort of man who claimed to have received prophecies from birds, and once tried to reform church taxation by proposing a levy on loud hymn singing. He saw the unrest around Stephen as an opportunity. According to later chronicles, he marched into Rome with about 40 retainers and one suspiciously short war-horse named Lumpy. The horse wore ceremonial blankets stitched with verses from Leviticus, though only half were spelled correctly. Adalbert, to the surprise of many and the dismay of Stephen, began holding public sermons in ruined libraries, where he argued passionately that the real crime wasn't what Formosus did, but how badly the Church had handled his afterlife. In possibly his most memorable speech he declared, "Ye shall not rebuke the bones, for the bones tire not of accusation," a line which, despite its complete lack of clarity, later appeared on decorative lintels across southern Italy. Within a month, Adalbert had gathered a coalition of church reformers, skeptics, and men whose only true complaint was that the wine no longer had enough body. Under mounting pressure and a growing chorus of people pointing at thunderclouds and shouting, "See!" Stephen VI was arrested. Some records suggest he was imprisoned in a monastic cell with especially echoey walls, while others say he was merely banished to the basilica catacombs with a shelf full of boring relics and 2 jars of turnips. Either way, his final days were not peaceful. He died within a year, possibly strangled by persons unknown, or possibly by a highly motivated curtain rod. Sources differ, but not by much. With Stephen gone and public appetite for exhumation-based justice rapidly fading, the Church faced a quiet crisis. How exactly does one walk back from a dead Pope trial without appearing melodramatic? The answer, as ever, was bureaucracy. A following Pope named Theodore, quiet, non-confrontational, fond of embroidery, declared all of Formosus's acts posthumously reinstated. Letters were sent, ceremonies were redone. The phrase "oops" appeared in no formal documents, but hovered in the margins of many. And yet the ghost of the Cadaver Synod lingered. Not literally, although one monk swore he heard sighing from the reliquary room until someone pointed out the wind had dislodged a tapestry. But metaphorically, the damage was done. Future popes tread more carefully with papal predecessors, preferring posthumous edits to actual disinterment. A statue of Formosus went up 3 centuries later in a side alcove of St. John's, subtle, uncelebrated, and often mistaken for a medieval locksmith. Of course, none of this entirely prevented further absurdities in church history, but it did set an unusually difficult benchmark. For all the feuding, faith and fire and brimstone sermons to follow, no one ever again managed to top the solemnity of a courtroom where the star witness had to be tied to his own chair. And really, it takes a special kind of confidence to argue theology with someone whose jaw has been wired shut since last autumn. Still, in all the liturgical chaos, some found odd comfort. One anonymous nun from a Florentine convent later wrote in a diary that the ordeal had reminded her of a crucial truth, that if even popes could misplace their dignity in the bottom of a river, the rest of us might be forgiven for slightly burning the lentils. As word of the Cadaver Synod spread beyond Rome's crumbling walls, reactions ranged from horrified bewilderment to deeply confused applause. Bishops in faraway dioceses, like Lyon and Mainz, sent letters back to Rome that can only be described as the 9th century equivalent of, "Are you okay?" Meanwhile, back in the Eternal City, Pope Stephen VI, fresh off the high of legally reprimanding a corpse, found his appetite for the dramatic surprisingly undiminished. He began referring to Formosus exclusively as the blasphemous ex-pope, even in private correspondence, which suggested that either he took the whole affair very seriously or had completely lost the thread. Emboldened by the success of his ventriloquist-style logic in court, Stephen decided the problem was not just Formosus, but everything Formosus had ever touched. This included the bishops he had consecrated, the documents he had signed, and apparently a surprisingly high number of ceremonial hats. In a move that would later be classified as wildly impractical, Stephen attempted to retroactively annul every official act Formosus had performed while Pope. This meant that suddenly dozens of church officials lost their titles, their authority, and in one tragicomic case, their access to the papal wine cellar. Allegedly, Bishop Robert of Spoleto had to be gently escorted out after attempting to use his now invalid documents to reclaim a particularly expensive vintage of Alban Hills white. At this point, even the Roman mob, who had tolerated quite a lot up to now, including papal assassinations, bribery, and one cardinal's brief but enthusiastic adventure in amateur bear wrangling, began to mutter that perhaps things had gone a bit sideways. Whispered rumours snuck through the taverns, aided by the rising popularity of a song whose chorus included the phrase, "His Holiness hath lost the plot, and buried it in the catacombs with his dignity." Not exactly chart-topping material, but memorable. Amid all this ecclesiastical entropy, a new figure emerged, a monk by the name of Brother Gerontius, who had previously kept a low profile cataloguing relics of indeterminate authenticity. Gerontius was short, increasingly bald, and fond of wearing sandals even in the rain. He had no political power, but a surprisingly loud voice and an ancient copy of canonical law that he liked to thump dramatically during sermons. Declaring the Cadaver Synod an outrage against reason, the gospel, and basic hygiene, he began gathering sympathizers under a banner stitched with the Latin words for "Maybe let the dead be dead." Of course, factions began to form. On one side, the supporters of Pope Stephen, spiralling ever deeper into theological cosplay. On the other, the followers of Gerontius, who met nightly in a cold chapel and loudly debated whether ghosts could be excommunicated. Not to be outdone in this competition of escalating absurdity, Stephen's faction introduced a new policy requiring all future bishops to publicly renounce Formosus before ordination. Candidates stood in line to swear oaths while glancing nervously at the churchyard, as if half expecting the ex-pope's shriveled hand to claw its way back and give them a disapproving thumbs down. But chaos has a rhythm to it, like Gregorian chant played on a hurdy-gurdy, and it did not stay contained for long. A group of disillusioned palace guards, most of whom had been promised a raise after the trial, and instead received commemorative medallions and a confusing thank-you sermon, decided they had seen enough. Late one evening, after a tense argument over who should pay for lamp oil, they arrested Pope Stephen. No blood was shed, just a lot of shouting and repeated use of the phrase, "With all due respect, Your Holiness, please stop screaming." With Stephen detained in a monastery that reportedly smelled heavily of musty parchment and pickled turnips, the Church scrambled to find a new pope who would appeal to both the pro-trial and anti-zombie legal theatre camps. The eventual choice was Pope Romanus, who had an agreeable face, no controversial opinions, and an enduring talent for pretending nothing unusual had happened. He quietly invalidated the corpse trial verdict, reinstated about half the bishops, and diplomatically ignored anyone still referring to Formosus as the heretical furniture occupant. Unfortunately for Romanus, stability was not fashionable in 9th century Rome. Within a few weeks he had been thoroughly deposed by supporters of an obscure nobleman known as Lambert of Spoleto. Lambert, a man with a fondness for velvet tunics and an unaccountable number of pet falcons, believed the synod had not gone far enough. His dream was to set up an ecclesiastical council that would formally resurrect and retry a half-dozen other dead popes, just in case they had left behind unresolved grievances. One proposed agenda item read simply, "Pope John VIII, Revenge." At around this time, somewhere in the countryside, a group of unofficial chroniclers calling themselves the Order of St. Eustace, self-appointed, began compiling tales of these events into a series of hand-illuminated manuscripts. Unfortunately, they had a habit of illustrating scenes from the hearings with fanciful beasts and one inexplicable image where Formosus appears to be holding an ice cream cone. Scholars continue to debate whether this was meant as satire, or if one scribe had simply never seen a papal blessing gesture rendered correctly. Back in Rome, Brother Gerontius tried once more to restore sanity by calling for a citywide fast and 40 days of meditation on humility. What he got instead was an impromptu street play reenacting the Cadaver Synod with sock puppets. The actor playing Pope Stephen reportedly gave the performance of a lifetime, including an original monologue where he screamed at a loaf of bread he believed to be possessed by Formosus's soul. The audience applauded for well over 20 minutes, then rioted over who had the best view. The irony, of course, is that all these efforts to either condemn or redeem a dead man only made Formosus more powerful in death than he ever was in life. Statues were secretly commissioned despite papal protest, and at least one tavern named their strongest ale, Cadaverus Maximus, described as undrinkably bold, with notes of oak and ecclesiastical regret. Pilgrims whispered tales of funeral cloths that healed gout, while others claimed to dream of Formosus nightly, usually asking for his fingers back. By now, the line between politics and performance had not so much blurred as vanished entirely. Rome, restless and perpetually one pigeon feather away from collapse, spun through a manic swirl of popes, counter-popes, forgotten relics, misplaced bishops, and at least 2 competing versions of the Nicene Creed. And at the centre of it all, like an unearthed marionette whose strings everyone wanted to pull, there remained the strange, silent legacy of one unfortunate pope who had merely wanted to serve, but wound up becoming history's most litigated corpse. We are now, for better or worse, at the height of this ecclesiastical fever dream. Everything has been tried, nothing has been learned. And somewhere in Rome, a choir is rehearsing a requiem that might also be a satirical opera. No one is certain any more. But the bass section insists on wearing judges' robes. That might have been the climax, but as anyone who's ever hosted a particularly awkward dinner party can tell you, it's not the initial disaster that haunts you. It's the clean-up. And medieval Rome was about to learn that exhuming a pope for courtroom theatre tends to ripple outward in ways you don't fully anticipate, even if you're a pope. In the immediate aftermath of the so-called Cadaver Synod, the people of Rome developed what modern historians generously call a vibe. Mistrust festered in corners of basilicas. Pilgrims whispered nervously at fountains. Even the cats seemed unusually judgmental. You could hardly enter a monastery without overhearing someone muttering about corpse desecration while pretending to stir lentil stew. And for the monks at San Clemente, the incident became so spiritually disorienting that they spent an entire week praying backwards. No one corrected them. It didn't help that Pope Stephen VI began behaving even more erratically. No longer content with conducting rites of horror, he appointed a man named Bishop Rataldus of Porto as chief investigator of corporeal heresies, a title he invented on the spot, and which led to Rataldus showing up at churches with a magnifying glass and a shovel, insisting he had papal authority to verify the orthodoxy of skeletons. He never found any heretical bones, but he did accidentally dig up a statue of Mercury, which he mistook for a pagan bishop and excommunicated. Meanwhile, Rome's sewer system became the unintended final destination of too many disgraced religious relics. Some say that's how St. Apollinaris's left pinky ring ended up briefly functioning as a drain plug. When flushed worship artifacts started appearing near the Forum Boreum, the city's butchers took it as a sign of divine disapproval, and for 5 weeks they refused to slaughter goats, which might have gone unnoticed were it not for Rome's sudden and deeply confusing goat surplus. As gossip about the trial of the dead Pope spread across Christendom, letters began to arrive from increasingly perplexed bishops. The Bishop of Lyon gently asked if perhaps the court transcripts meant something different in Latin. The Archbishop of Mainz wrote 2 pages on legal precedent before conceding he had no idea where to file the result, and from Constantinople came a delicately phrased scroll asking essentially what in God's name was going on. That scroll mysteriously vanished in the papal archives between a treatise on fish fasting and an unmailed resignation letter from the previous pope, possibly Formosus, possibly several previous popes. But the most unexpected consequence settled within the Roman clergy itself, particularly among younger deacons, freshly robed and eager to avoid their own posthumous trials. A group of them took to carrying small written disclaimers in their sleeves, reading, "I recuse myself in life or in death from all ecclesiastical disputes." These became popular among parish officials, and one Benedictine abbey even began offering them as embroidered bookmarks, sold at a modest profit to pilgrims who now feared both sin and spontaneous corpse litigation. As for the terrified deacon forced to act as Formosus's defence attorney, he quietly fled to Ostia and took up apiculture. His letters from the period are charming in tone, but notably monosyllabic when referencing trials, popes, or matters of canonical law. The bees presumably had no opinion, and that was the point. Over time, a curious fashion emerged in the Eternal City. Artistic depictions of saints and bishops started looking strangely upright, as if subtly hinting they preferred their leaders alive. Woodcarvers were commissioned to make altarpieces with saints shown actively breathing. Frescoes were touched up to remove anything suggesting spiritual lethargy. In one extreme case, St. Augustine was redrawn mid-stride, holding what appears to be a subpoena. The message was clear: in this church, no more resting in peace. Of course, Pope Stephen VI did not enjoy his victory for long. The Cadaver Synod had, unintentionally, united almost everyone in their disgust. His enemies in the clergy now had something rarer than political disagreement. They had shared nausea. And so, within a year, Stephen was imprisoned during what the official chronicle blandly called a shift in spiritual sentiment. He died in custody, either strangled by enraged guards or, as one account suggests, accidentally tripping fatally while trying to exit through a particularly narrow doorway during a fire drill. Records differ. The hallway reportedly did not. The next pope, Theodore II, swiftly reversed all decisions from the Cadaver Synod, but his reign lasted only 20 days, a tenure as brief as a quill's ink before it dries. In those 20 days he exhumed Pope Formosus's body again, reburied him with honours, annulled the corpse trial, and had the offending documents burned. An ambitious agenda for someone who barely had time to decorate his mitre. Legend says his papal seal was still warm when pressed into that last proclamation. But the see of St. Peter was not done yet. Enter Pope Sergius III. Elected a few years later, he reversed the reversal, declaring the Cadaver Synod valid again. This set in motion a cycle of ecclesiastical whiplash so dizzying that future papal historians were known to take breaks mid-chronicle to collect themselves with a walk and a particularly strong mead. No fewer than 3 popes in the next decade ruled against one another posthumously, using each other's bones as rhetorical cudgels. It would be funny if it weren't so ecclesiastically adjacent to necromancy. By now, the idea of legal judgments against the deceased became something of a running gag in both sacred texts and tavern poems. One satirical song from Ravenna included a verse about St. Peter issuing parking fines from the afterlife. A manuscript in Verona cryptically describes 20 saints arraigned for improper fasting. And somewhere, in the quieter back corners of the Lateran libraries, someone began drafting an imaginary legal codex titled Inter Mortuos et Legem, or Between the Dead and the Law. It was never published, lest anyone mistake it for permission. And yet, for all its surrealism, the events around Pope Formosus's trial served as a peculiar mirror to the Church's struggles, less about doctrine, more about power, more about panic, and far more about the human capacity for theatrical overreaction. It turns out that the line between divine authority and mortal insecurity can be surprisingly thin. No thicker, really, than the brittle ligament of a long-dead ring finger. So in the shadow of ruined basilicas and beneath frescoes that seem a little too wide-eyed, one question settled over medieval Rome like fine dust. If a pope's authority can chase you beyond the grave, where exactly, as a weary soul, are you supposed to seek refuge? Perhaps in the apiary of Ostia, or behind a very narrow doorway. Now, you might assume that after staging a grotesque puppet show starring the cadaverous remains of Pope Formosus, Pope Stephen VI and his inner circle might have taken a moment, just a quiet moment, to reflect. Perhaps ask themselves how it had come to this. But no. This was 9th century Rome, where reflection was for marble statues and hand mirrors, not for bishops with agendas. Instead, the days that followed the Cadaver Synod were filled with an almost surreal busywork, mostly involving people trying to act like any of this was normal. First came the bureaucrats. These were church scribes and administrators tasked with updating the papal records to reflect that, yes, Pope Formosus had indeed been pope, but also not pope, and also guilty, but also dead. Charting the legal status of a pope defendant was not covered in any canon law handbook, so they ended up crafting new Latin phrases that roughly translated to things like retroactively spiritually invalid and formally exhumed authority. One scribe reportedly developed a nervous stammer that only activated when saying the word Formosus, which made him oddly popular with certain barroom storytellers. One of the oddest footnotes belonged to a Benedictine monk named Floro, known mostly for his obsessive record-keeping and his habit of measuring spoons before prayer. Floro took it upon himself to track down every bishop ordained by Formosus, which amounted to dozens of men now suddenly in spiritual limbo. He did this armed with a donkey, 2 baskets full of dusty documents, and a bell he rang before entering each village, solemnly announcing, "Your bishop may not count." He was chased off with old sandals multiple times, but considered it a moral success. The donkey, named Vespasian for reasons no one ever explained, remained indifferent. Meanwhile, opposition to Stephen's actions began to gather quietly, like mould in velvet. Some of the nobility, historically bored by theology, but deeply suspicious of corpse desecration as a setting precedent, started asking polite but pointy questions. Chief among them was Marozia, a noble woman in her teens, who would later become one of Rome's most powerful figures. At the time she was just watching, listening, rehearsing her expressions of thoughtful concern, a talent she would weaponize brilliantly in later years. She once described Stephen's eyes as the sort you find on a goat just discovering water, which was either a criticism or an oddly poetic compliment. Even the clergy began to shift uncomfortably in their ornate chairs. In churches across Rome, sermons began including cautious terminology. Phrases like, "Who can know the sins of the dead?" and "Let us not dig where peace has been placed," started cropping up in homilies like weeds between paving stones. One bishop tried to protest formally, but mistakenly submitted his letter of grievance directly to Stephen's cook. The cook, a Sardinian named Lucio, hung it on the pantry wall beside recipes for salted eel, and no one noticed for 3 weeks. By now, Pope Stephen's popularity was beginning to rot at the same pace as Formosus had. There were whispers, and then murmurs, and then sudden silences when he entered the room, which, for a pope, is never a good sign. The devout began requesting other confessors. Religious painters began revising their commissions to include fewer popes and more generic cherubs. One artist who had started a mosaic of Pope Stephen was so unnerved by the current air of ecclesiastical confusion that he simply stopped halfway through and labelled the figure "man of influence, possibly divine." Then came the pigeons. A particularly large flock took up residence at the Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano, where they began to set up what could only be described as an aggressive squatter colony. Their droppings coated statues, altars, and solemn moments with relentless indifference. The priests suggested fasting. The deacons suggested a hawk. The townsfolk suggested burning sage. One cardinal attempted to formally excommunicate the birds during a poorly attended Wednesday vespers, but was shouted down for misusing ecclesiastical authority. Still, there was something poetic about the timing. Even the skies, it seemed, had an opinion. As tensions grew stranger and tenser, Stephen doubled down. He had brass plaques inscribed, stating that Formosus's papacy had been null and void. These plaques were nailed into church walls, hung in minor chapels, and once accidentally mailed to a bishop in Naples, along with a fruitcake intended for his birthday. The bishop responded with polite thanks and a bewildered note that simply said, "Delicious, curious discourse." By the summer of 897, it became clear that supporting Stephen was no longer a viable retirement plan. The Roman mobs, who had initially been amused by the weird pageantry and the thrill of public spectacle, began to grow uneasy. Sewer workers refused to clean anything near the Tiber. Children, who had previously played Pope and Cardinal with local dogs, started pretending to be hermits instead. One boy was reportedly seen building a tiny monastery out of apple crates and avoided direct eye contact for a full year. The final nudge came on a sticky, wine-soured evening, when a servant accidentally spilled ink across a vital church ledger. The incident was minor, but when Stephen shrieked about sabotage from the beyond, the chamber fell silent. Even his advisers, loyal mostly out of habit and the comfort of papal wine, began to fidget. One finally excused himself to check on a goose and never returned. The goose later appeared in Florence, where it was adopted as a symbol of modest escape. Eventually the backlash caught up, as it always does. Stephen was imprisoned in the same cell that had once held rebellious monks and perhaps an unusually verbose goat. Accounts differ. He was found strangled several months later under circumstances so vague that historians have simply agreed to raise an eyebrow and move on. Pope Formosus, posthumously exonerated once Rome sobered up a little, was fished out of the Tiber by sympathetic monks and reburied with surprising gentleness. Officially, the Church declared the Cadaver Synod null, void, and unhelpful to spiritual understanding, a categorization that might warrant its own stained glass window. And as for the deacon who had served as the corpse's legal counsel, he quietly retired to a monastery in Capua, where he grew figs, whispered legal philosophy to bees, and never spoke of the trial again. But he did, curiously, keep the shoes he'd worn that day. They were displayed beside his bed until his passing, labelled with a handwritten tag that read simply, "A lesson in listening." Meanwhile, the city of Rome, in its usual fashion, tried very hard to pretend this was all perfectly normal. The local clergy kept up their daily schedules, which now included dodging rumours that the Holy Spirit had been seen weeping softly near the Lateran Palace. Merchants in the Forum started selling commemorative tunics bearing the phrase "Trial of the Century, 800s edition," embroidered in slightly uneven Latin. A wine seller named Lucius began bottling a vintage called Formosan Red, described as bold, unsettling, and prone to unpredictable aftertastes. The corpse trial had attracted international attention, or rather it would have if anyone outside of central Italy cared to notice. A delegation of Frankish bishops passing through Rome looked upon the spectacle, nodded solemnly, and then promptly refused to get involved. Their official statement, written on parchment that smelled faintly of goat cheese, read simply, "We saw nothing, we heard nothing, and we have absolutely no idea who Formosus is." It was a diplomatic masterpiece of plausible deniability, and an excellent reminder that the 9th century was no stranger to strategic memory loss. Back inside the Vatican, Pope Stephen's mood was beginning to fray at the edges. Not from guilt, of course. Stephen did not really do guilt. He did obsession. Specifically, the kind of obsession that requires nightly inspections of mausoleum locks and overly detailed dreams about posthumous court procedures. His personal chapel began to fill with scrolls bearing new legal ideas, a draft for post-mortem appeals court, a preliminary outline for penitential excavations, and a curious note that simply read, "Trial by fire, corpse version." He was, if nothing else, thorough. Further complicating things was the arrival of a rather enthusiastic monk named Brother Venantius, who insisted, quite loudly, that Formosus had been framed by a demon in the shape of a lowercase bishop. No one quite understood what this meant, but Venantius refused to explain unless offered a loaf of stale barley bread and exactly 1 hour of uninterrupted sermon time. Upon receiving both, he used the time to shout about fish who wore mitres and sang psalms backwards. He was later assigned to the archives, where he made it his mission to catalogue every papal toenail record from the last 2 centuries. Elsewhere, dark rumours began to spread that the trial had cursed Rome's aqueducts. The Tiber, already offended by having a deceased pope hurled into it like so many unwanted cats, reportedly changed colour near the point of entry. Anxious locals whispered of an eerie green foam and one fishing boat that refused to float upright after casting nets too close to the Marmor Falls. Official priests responded by blessing the river responded by rising 3 inches overnight and carrying off a pontiff's hat hanging on a wooden post. Interpretations varied, but no one wore that style of hat again. Interestingly, not everyone disapproved of the posthumous trial. A nobleman named Count Albo of Trastevere found the whole affair refreshingly direct. He set up a tribunal in his courtyard and declared his late uncle guilty of drinking his wine reserves. The body in question was never found, but this did not stop Albo from sentencing it to 100 years of mild disapproval. He then publicly forgave the corpse and hosted a banquet in its honour, notable for featuring a strong cheese that moved slightly of its own volition. One guest claimed this was the true miracle of the evening. Back in the Curia, tensions were continuing to build. Several bishops began to worry, not because they were shocked. Most had seen worse during synods involving theological pronunciation debates, but because the precedent being set was, as one put it, a bit too legally ambitious. There were murmurs that if digging up papal mistakes became fashionable, no one's grave was safe. A few quietly arranged for their tombs to be guarded by retired crusaders, although no crusade had yet occurred. These guards mostly drank honey mead and recited war chants at pigeons. The legal records from the trial, painstakingly copied by a scribe with extremely neat handwriting and a habit of drawing tiny skulls in the margins, circulated into minor libraries and abbeys. Monks in Lorsch reportedly staged a dramatic reading of the transcript, featuring a dried gourd dressed as the corpse and a nervous kitchen assistant posing as the defence. It ended in applause, 2 conversions, and one accidentally started fire. Local morale, surprisingly, improved for a week. But the church leadership was not pleased. Word eventually reached Emperor Lambert, who had been travelling through Spoleto in pursuit of either political unity or a woman who claimed to be descended from Julius Caesar's cousin. He wrote a very serious letter to Pope Stephen, advising calm and perhaps a reconsideration of courtroom corpse etiquette. The letter was sealed with a heavy crest, modestly blood-stained. It arrived in Rome 3 days before Stephen received new inspiration, the possibility of excommunicating the remains of past emperors just to see what would happen. Still, the public's interest showed no signs of waning. A theatre troupe in Florence began performing puppet shows based on the trial, including a rather popular scene in which the corpse pope rises up mid-verdict and gives a long speech about ecclesiastical corruption in flawless Tuscan. The show was banned, then unbanned, then awarded an honorary fig from a local cardinal who claimed it captured the tone of the apocalypse in a charming and digestible manner. Even the children were not immune. Games inspired by the event began popping up. One popular pastime involved stacking stones to resemble a skeleton, dressing it in old cloth, and declaring it guilty of cake theft. The penalty varied depending on region, but generally involved mild shaming and gentle burial under an herb garden. Parents were unsure how to parent during such times, but most defaulted to limiting playtime near burial grounds and strongly discouraging role-play involving divine judgment. And yet, with each passing week, the absurdity began to feel strangely normalized. Rome, having stared directly into institutional madness and lit candles around it, began adjusting. The chaos had a rhythm to it now. The pigeons flew sideways near the basilica, but only slightly. The corpse no longer spoke in dreams, or if it did, only to those who already talked to fruit. People adapted, as people tend to do when surrounded by history that absolutely refuses to behave. Still, unease hung just beyond the city walls like a misplaced relic. Something had shifted. Behind the high altars and ornate chalices, even the quietest friars could feel it, a sense that the line between the living and dead had been smudged, and Rome, never one to resist a smudge, had turned it into a decorative border. And at the centre of it all, a throne that had once held a decomposing pontiff, now sat conspicuously empty, as though waiting for the next idea no one should ever have. Historians call it the Cadaver Synod, as if giving it a Latin name would help it sound less like something dreamed up during a fever after too much salted fish. And maybe that's part of the charm. Medieval Rome did not do things halfway. If you were going to haul a corpse into court, then by all means give him a full trial, a defence attorney trembling in the corner, and a room full of clergy pretending it was perfectly normal to cross-examine a man who had, let's be honest, seen better days. But Rome, being Rome, was not yet finished. Like all good political farces, this one had several sequels, and none of them improved the plot. The public, who had initially crowded in to see the trial like it was some grisly Punch and Judy show, eventually decided perhaps a corpse trial was bad optics for the church. Pope Stephen, proud conductor of this composting court, fell out of favour rather rapidly and with considerable enthusiasm from all sides. The backlash was swift and not particularly subtle. After the trial, rumours began swirling that the late Formosus was not entirely pleased about being posthumously insulted and then hurled into the Tiber. Strange things happened. Clergymen reported odd sounds in the churches. Crops didn't grow where they ought to. A goat allegedly spoke Latin in protest. This may have been metaphorical or wishful thinking. It is sometimes hard to tell in medieval chronicles. To calm the increasingly restless populace and possibly appease any pathologically articulate goats, Pope Stephen's enemies had him imprisoned. Within a few months he was found strangled in his cell. No trial that time, just dead and left there, unphotogenic and unspectacular, quite unlike his celebrated victim, which seems appropriate in a poetic, morally lopsided sense. Meanwhile, the church quietly fished Pope Formosus out of the river. Enough time had passed, and they had perhaps rethought their whole corpse as defendant legal strategy. Another pope, there were frankly many of them at this point, cycling through office like contestants in a doomed pageant, ordered a reburial. Formosus was reinterred with basic dignity, which in 9th century Rome meant only one exhumation per papacy. And yet, even with the solemn reburial and whispered regrets, the ghost of the cadaver trial lingered in the Vatican's halls. Or perhaps it was the smell. Rome never quite shook the image of a rotting pontiff perched stubbornly on a wooden throne, his fingers twitching from memory or maggots, while bishops debated canon law as if decorum had never been murdered in front of them. Oddly, the body count did not slow down. Following the Cadaver Synod, the papacy settled into a long, cosy relationship with chaos. Over the next few decades, popes were poisoned, imprisoned, mutilated and exiled, with a frequency that suggests someone may have misplaced the user manual for moral authority. At one point, a teenage boy became pope, not because of his brilliance or sanctity, but because his father thought it would be funny. The church, it turned out, had become a family business with the HR policies of a wild boar. Through it all, Formosus remained unbothered, stationary, and definitively dead. Whatever else he was in life, a reformer, a schismatic, a man with suspiciously large hands no one could explain, he had achieved perhaps the greatest honour Rome could bestow, to be both physically desecrated and historically unforgettable, a minor pope resurrected by scandal, promoted posthumously by grotesque theatre. His story in the end became less about justice and more about spectacle, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought an oath of office ends at death, and a reminder that medieval Rome did not always work by the conventional rules. Why bother with reasonable discourse when you can have necrotic litigation and a courtroom that smells like old incense and worse secrets? Some say you can still feel it, wandering the basilicas late at night, a ripple in the silence just under the marble and dust. Formosus, mildly annoyed, tapping ghostly fingers that were once ceremonially lopped off, waiting for someone to explain exactly what he was convicted of. Meanwhile, the church has moved on. New doctrines, new scandals, plumbing that mostly works, and yet there is something undeniably compelling about that scene. A decomposed pope in full regalia, listing slightly to one side, silent as eternity, while priests yell legal terms he never agreed to. It is, if nothing else, a master-class in committing to the bit. Rome always understood that tradition and pageantry do not require logic, only confidence and a reasonably sturdy chair. So tonight, if you find yourself lying awake, wondering whether history is just a long series of increasingly desperate cover-ups, remember this. Once, in the heart of the Christian world, a pope put another pope on trial after death, and nobody stopped him. Not because it made sense, but because, for a brief window in time, it felt like the only sensible thing to do. Somewhere, beneath the layers of time and denial, Formosus rests again, probably, unless he's been dug up for yet another posthumous career change. Meanwhile, the throne sits empty, or at least recently disinfected, and beyond the colonnades, in the soft flicker of candlelight, history exhales, unsettling, a little sour, and still faintly ecclesiastical, like holy water with a hint of mildew, like incense with something burning beneath it that should not be burning at all. Sleep well, and keep your fingers crossed, preferably attached.